Welcome to the Sorch podcast, where we explore Sikh and wider South Asian history, art and philosophy with historians, artists and researchers.
The energy really that you give out, it's quite, I don't know quite what the word is, but it's it's almost like fuel. I don't know quite how else to explain it, but just in the small interactions I've had with yourself, or just on Twitter or in the run up to this, there's something that you give out that makes you want to then continue it. So yeah, no, thank you for that. But yeah, sorry.
No, I have to say how much I appreciate that though. Like you're already going to start me off crying, Amr.
Oh, no, please don't do what my mom does. Like I moved out about, 3 years ago now. And even now I'll go over and I'll leave the house and she'll start crying. And I'm like, Mom, like why are you crying? Yeah, but you probably know more than I do, right? That in our community, the respect to your elders, and especially for me, I think you just have to be appreciative. So just to introduce you then to everyone else, I have the pleasure of talking to Sharnjit Kaur from Canada. She's a PhD candidate at the University of British Columba, focusing on museums and critical race theory. She's a co-coordinator at the South Asian Studies Institute, an instructor at the University of Fraser Valley, and a co-curator of the Sikh Heritage Museum located in the National Historic Gurdit Singh Temple, which is its official name. Thank you, obviously, for making the time. Yeah, please don't start crying during the podcast. I can just about handle my mom doing that. Please don't do that to me now.
I'll try. Once you get to know me, Amr, you're gonna know. Like, like I just cry so much.
Oh gosh,
I'm an emotional basket
no,
case.
Don't worry, that's fine. That's fair. I don't blame you. I can well imagine that my mom she sounds exactly like you, and it sounds like you guys will get on like a house on fire. So yeah. No, I look forward to it. Okay, so I know I've given you a bit of an introduction myself, and to be fair, it is quite a mouthful, but could you perhaps give us an explanation of how you and your family and your ancestry ended up in Canada, and then how you've ended up in all of these various places? Because you're a PhD, you're at the South Asian Institute, there's all of these kind of various roles going on. So how did you end up there in the first place?
Okay, that's a great question. So I was actually originally born in the UK. So I was born in Bradford, and my parents also were married in the UK, like they met in the UK, but my dad's originally from India, Punjab, India, and my mom's actually from Kenya. So she was born in Kenya. Her mom and dad had moved there, I believe, to work as part of the British Empire, right? There's a lot of Sikh communities in parts of Africa and Southeast Africa. But my brother, my sister, and I were all born in England. We didn't live there very long as younger children. We migrated to Canada, or Alberta in particular, in 88. And I've lived where I live now in Abbotsford since 1992. So I've been in West Canada and BC for a very, very long time. And this is my home. Like this is my kind of comfort space. This community that I've built is my safe space. And so though we do go back to India, every couple of years, I rarely go back to England. I don't think I've been back in a very, very long time. I think 20 years it's been since I've been back to England. So my home spaces are really Western Canada, British Columbia, and Punjab, India is where I kind of look back to in terms of my historical roots and where I get energized from. That's a little bit about, my family migration history. How I came to be in the role that I am is also interesting. I've always been a history buff. So I did my undergraduate degree in history and English extended minor. And my master's thesis actually looked at Nihangs in the court of Maharaja Ranjit Singh. And that was just by accident, really. Like I happened to be reading some books, looking at travel accounts by, white British colonials, and something piqued my interest about the way they wrote about the Nihangs in the 19th century. And so that is what led me to do my master's thesis on the Nihangs in the court of Ranjit Singh. And then all of a sudden, I became involved in the work of the Sikh Heritage Museum here in Abbotsford, BC, through my work at the South Asian Studies Institute. And that really began in 2011. And that was when we were celebrating the centennial 100-year celebration of the Gurdit Singh Temple, which is the official name of the Gurdwara. So in 2011, it was 100 years since the Gurdwara was built. And something about that moment has impacted me to this very day. There was, nationwide recognition. There was so much energy and a buzz. And I realized that this site is so incredibly special to me as a Sikh, but also, just about community histories. And there's so much that this Gurdwara can give in so many different spaces and places. And so I became drawn to the curatorial work of the Sikh Heritage Museum. And I'm privileged that I can do that while working the job that I am at the University of the Fraser Valley. And since then, it's become my passion project. And that's what ended up feeding my PhD work. And it's led me to this moment where I'm just in the midst of writing my dissertation chapters right now. And one of those chapters is going to be looking at the history of the Sikh Heritage Museum and the Gurdwara in Abbotsford, and how it's kind of a decolonized project because it's actually counter to the way a lot of white colonial museums work, right? The colonial foundations of the museum is a problematic foundation. So our Gurdwara is something very special. So that's where I am today. And what I hope to do going forward is look at museums and how museums like the Sikh Heritage Museum offer so much to the world.
Wow. Okay. So you mentioned that you were born in the UK, but from the sounds of things, it sounds like you identify pretty much with being Canadian. So in terms of your identity in that respect, like how do you identify? Because I think an interesting thing I find in England, and especially with the legacy of the British Empire, is there's always this clash between being Sikh and British. And I think I don't necessarily, perhaps I'm just blind to it, but I don't perhaps necessarily see the same issues in other diaspora communities.
You know, the hyphenated question is always there, I think, for many diasporic communities, and it exists in Canada too. In fact, the etymology of how we were named in this country is really interesting, right? Like we were called, quote, Hindus when we first arrived. So Hindoos. Then we went from being Hindus to East Indians, which was also problematic if you look at the historical legacy of where that word comes from. And then we moved from East Indians to Indo-Canadian. And now we're in this strange space. Like you asked me what I identify as. I actually don't identify as just Canadian because I don't conform to kind of these nation building projects. So I'm not necessarily a fan of saying I'm a Canadian. I say I'm Sikh Canadian. I don't even say Punjabi Canadian, right? I say I'm Sikh. And part of that identity isn't always something I've always called myself. You asked me 10 years ago, I may have very well said, yeah, I'm Canadian. Right? Like I've changed, and that evolution is allowed to happen. And part of that evolution is me learning more about my history, me learning more about the foundations of my faith, and, you know, the problematic nature of even calling myself Canadian and what that means to displacing Indigenous peoples and their very foundation of owning all this land. That's my growth. So today I will call myself a Sikh Canadian, not Punjabi Canadian, not Indo-Canadian, Sikh Canadian, because I truly in my heart identify as a Sikh first.
No, that's a fair response. Just continuing on from that, then you mentioned that the museum at the Gurdwara is in itself a decolonized project. I'd just love for you to expand slightly more on that and what you mean by that for everyone listening, and perhaps comparing that to kind of the usual kind of museums that we're used to, kind of like the British Museum.
When I teach classes sometimes about public history, I show a clip from the Black Panther, and it's a clip from the British Museum. And the main protagonist is in a very white, sanitized space looking at, quote, African artifacts boxed in cases. What I tell students is in that matter of 2 minutes, that movie has unpacked everything that's wrong with museums like the British Museum, right? They sanitize us, they dehumanize us, and they create their stories, often written by, quote, white experts, about us and who we are and our identity. And the Sikh Heritage Museum does none of that. And that's why inherently it is a decolonized space. The history of that Gurdwara is that its construction began in 1908. The 40 or 50 Sikh men who worked in Abbotsford at that time literally carried the lumber piece by piece up a half a kilometer stretch to build that Gurdwara. And that Gurdwara is intact the way it was built 100 plus years ago. So when I say there's an energy, like you talk about my energy, there's an energy in that building. Oh my God, the energy in there is just, it's something else. And I get to curate and design exhibits in what used to be the Langar Hall, because our community's grown, so it wasn't viable anymore as a Langar Hall. So how beautiful is that? Something that was a space of seva in terms of nourishment of food has become a place of seva for nourishment of the mind. And when we do exhibit openings, it's also decolonized because we still go upstairs and matha tek. We do an ardas, and we have community members, non-Sikh, Sikh, many different communities come, and they know what they're going to do. They know they're going to go upstairs and matha tek and sit in a collective sangat. Then we go downstairs and honor the exhibit. That's like no other museum in the world, really.
No, it's not. No, it's not. Trust. Right? Yeah. No, you're right there. You're right. Why do you think then that even though we have spaces like that, academics like yourselves and others who are creating the narrative from our perspective or taking ownership of the narrative in that regard, why do you think there's such a backlash to academics or Sikh academics, and then this kind of, and to be honest, I've only ever seen this insult thrown out from people in America or Canada. I don't know whether that's just kind of like an American thing. I've never seen it in the UK, but it's kind of like, oh, he's a leftist or she's a leftist, and they're infiltrating Sikhi with their whatever it is, and it could be whatever label you want: communism, feminism, socialism, like the list goes on and on and on. Why do you think then that we're, as a community, having such a clash between actually owning the narrative and then almost kind of having this disassociative effect of, oh, actually, let's just completely not involve because the entire system's rigged almost?
So my answer is very simple to this. I think we, as a Sangat, are actually forgetting to learn and read and engage meaningfully. I think we've become so obsessed with social media that we only rely on social media to become our knowledge holders and to become our guides of conversations around Sikh history and Sikh identity. And I think that's really problematic, this trend that I am seeing, because most of us who are attacked aren't even being read properly. Right? Like nobody's taking the time to read the really in-depth research and work and actually embody and understand who we are. I was speaking to a Sikhraj from the Sikh archive, and he made this amazing comment saying, social media dehumanizes everybody. And that's what's happening with a lot of these, quote, leftist academics. We've become so dehumanized that anytime we put out anything that's, showcasing our work, we're automatically othered within our own Sangat and within our own community as though we're the enemy, without even actually meaningfully understanding, without even researching the website. Like, go to the website of the Heritage Gurdwara, look at the work we're doing, look at the exhibits we've put on Sikh feminism, on Ghadr, on Komagata Maru. But you just want to know in a 40-character soundbite what it is I'm doing. And from that, you're going to judge my whole identity and my whole ethos and my whole energy. That is dehumanizing. And of course, as we've seen, it happens in a gendered aspect. It happens in a transphobic, homophobic context. So within that dehumanizing, there's layers of oppression. It happens within an anti-caste or casteist context. And it's becoming very more insidious and popular to label us rather than learn from us.
I just love how in the last kind of 10 seconds you flipped into mother mode and went into Punjabi. Like, as soon as you said that, I went,
did I do that?
Yeah, I went, oh shit, she's gonna swing for someone in a second. I completely appreciate and see where you're coming from. Do you think that a lot of this also has to do with kind of the rise of, and I don't mean to kind of put it into such a small nutshell, but kind of this Trumpism effect of, if you don't like what the other person's saying, you kind of just quote unquote shit on them and hope they go away.
I think there's a connection in terms of what we choose to be fed by in our surroundings and our world, and what we eliminate and erase, right? Like, I was talking to somebody else about this. It's very interesting. Like, everything I'm fed is already feeding into a narrative of what I agree with in terms of social justice, in terms of gender equity, anything. I'm already being fed that because that's what I do. But as well and able and thinking human beings, we also need to learn to read other things from other perspectives. And I feel like there's this Trumpism effect is that the hate has overtaken the capacity to do that. Right? Like, I'm also not saying that I'm going to go try to see the RSS point of view and empathize with them. That's not what I'm saying, right? What I'm saying, there's a balance between total hate versus, where are people coming from such a space of inequity or harm that they think the way they do. There's a balance if I'm making sense of what I'm trying to say. I'm not going to support RSS or Hindutva or, Trumpism. I'm not going to support that. It is racist. And we have to start labeling that is racist and fascist. There are moments where we have to be clear in our boundaries, but at the same time, for those who are leaning towards more right-wing thinking and ideology, start to question, why do we think that way? Why are we being fed the narratives that we are? And I was watching a Netflix documentary about social media. We are being fed, let me tell you, right? Like, we know this. There are algorithms that are set in place to feed us narratives we already believe in. So a truly like attuned human being wouldn't be aware of this and become critical. Why is it that we've become so uncritical? We just take everything that's given to us on our phone or in our computers, and that's all that there is to it. No, open your minds to more. We don't do that anymore. And that's my worry, is that's why we are lending ourselves to this Trumpism effect and Modi effect.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think you're right in that social media definitely creates an echo chamber for your views. So you end up kind of with this people who will agree with you or will share those views with you, rather than having any type of kind of critical thought or anything just outside of those outside of your own constraints, so to speak.
Can I add to that, Amr, quickly
as well?
Please, and I just want to give an example, right? Like I posted something once and somebody very kindly messaged me saying, Sharn, that's kind of ableist language. Or I think it was something I said was harming somebody else. Right away, I checked myself and I said, well, somebody just reminded me that this word that I used was ableist. There's nothing wrong with checking yourself when it's harming somebody else. Like when you're oppressing a group of people who see themselves as silenced, erased, violence enacted on them, what is wrong with attuning ourselves to that? And that's the same with looking at transphobia in our community and homophobia. If somebody is telling you, I am erased from a Sangat, right? Like my experiences are not here. Or if they are, they're enacted upon in terms of violence. We have to attune ourselves to that and learn, not do the opposite, right? Like engage in more silencing. And it comes from ego, right? Like I was listening to Professor Bhupinder Pogles. I think you were really liking that too. I mean, that to me is a must listen for people who engage in like this quote leftist hate mongering or leftist pushing away. But he talks about, I think, about ego as well, right? Like if the tutu meme happens when we start saying my ego is being attacked. Right. And that's, of course, once again, inherent to something we're not supposed to be doing as Sikhs. We're supposed to put our egos to the side and actually engage in a knowledge building capacity. And that's why these podcasts are so important. You're building a corpus of knowledge for people to open-heartedly listen to.
And we're being honest in the actual conversation we're having, because by the premise is I don't know. And that's the entire fun of this. And by default, I have to learn. So I didn't know anything about Canadian Sikh history until I had to read about it for the podcast. And similarly, there was a podcast we've done with an artist and I knew nothing about kind of traditional art and Sikhian. So I had to read up about that. And it's kind of, but then it's also sharing that and hoping someone somewhere takes something positive from that, or is like, piques their interest or whatever. But just coming back then to Canada and Sikh history. So in the small research that I started with, it says that the first Sikhs ended up coming to Canada in 1904 and established themselves in British Columbia. They made up 90% of the 5,000 South Asians that had arrived there. Soon after, the Vancouver Khalsa Divan Society is established, and then in 1908, immigration is just banned outright. It was interesting, though, because as I was reading, it didn't seem like there was this complete kind of anti-Indian or anti-brown agenda, because there was newspapers from Canada in 1902 which actually said turbaned men excite interest or inspiring men from India held the crowds. I know it still kind of holds that slight Orientalist hinge, but it doesn't necessarily seem to be as negative as kind of some of the others. So first thing I wanted to ask is, why was there such a rapid kind of up and down in the immigration towards non-Canadians, I guess is probably the easiest way of labeling them in this situation. Like why did it go from kind of, you guys, like 5,000 of you can turn up, and then all of a sudden it was like, just ban it?
So just a couple of things with the intro. The 1904 stat is based on Census Canada data. And as we know, census taking is always problematic because there's actually oral histories that say there were Sikhs living in Golden, British Columbia, which is up north, BC, as early as like 1897, 1898. So there may have been non-traditional, or you could say, quote, illegal pathways by which there were Sikh settlers in British Columbia pre-1904. But official Canadian census data is what we have to go by, apparently, as historians. But that's always being challenged now, right? Like oral archives challenges traditional archives. So that's why when you were looking at, the Sikh Heritage Museum Canada in Brampton, they even argue that 1897, 1898, because they think, I think they believe Gurdit Singh came to Canada, or there's an argument for that history. But I'm talking about permanent settlement. And so permanent settlement by Sikh settlers was around that 1902 to 1904 area. And, your question about how there were ups and downs in the reception of Sikh Canadians who came, they were so small in number to begin with that not many people noticed, in the sense that their physical spaces they felt weren't being invaded. That was often a language used, in the newspapers as well. Their jobs were not being taken. It really came down to these spaces and places that they either saw or, didn't see Sikh. When the number started to increase, which was around 1907, all of a sudden, white Anglo-Saxon Europeans felt like their jobs were at risk. A lot of these Sikh laborers, like Chinese Canadians, Japanese Canadians at the time, and Indigenous workers, were paid a fraction less than, white European counterparts. And there's a labor extraction taking place as well, right? Like there's labor exploitation taking place where a lot of these men were doing triple the amount of work, paid much, much less than white European settlers. So the argument was that these white people felt like their jobs were being taken. And it's so interesting that that's a common rhetoric that you hear up until this very day. It's an excuse, right? It's an excuse that white people use to assume that they have a claim and ownership of a land space. And in the Canadian context, they had none. That land that they're working on is on Indigenous land that was taken and stolen by the Canadian government. So even the context by which white people think that they're being invaded, their labor is being invaded, their economic status is a pretense. It's all racist. It's a racism. It's a racist state formation that's taking place. But the other thing is, I've read this amazing book by Nayan Shah, and he writes about the visible Sikh settler was unlike anything white Europeans experienced, right? Like many of these men wore the stars. They kept their kesh for as long as they could, many of them, until they were forced to have to cut their hair or shave because they were almost destitute. They couldn't get anything. But the men keeping their kesh and keeping their dastar were so different than what anything white European settlers had seen, that, there was a freakish aspect to it. And Chinese Canadians faced that as well, because many Chinese settlers kept long braids as well. So it for them, it like totally was anti-patriarchal. It questioned their gender norms and long hair. That's so odd. Things like that freakishized our community. We didn't even have proper places where we could cremate, right? We had to go into the forest. And I've seen newspaper articles of Abbotsford where, white European settlers are like calling us freaks because we're cremating. These things created a narrative about us as an other, as an undesirable, in the words of Ali Kazmi, right? So I always push away from the narrative of, they worried about their jobs. It's not jobs. It's part of a machine of racism and state-sanctioned racism. The same time that, people in Western Canada are complaining about their jobs being taken, in Eastern Canada and Ottawa, there's legislations taking place that are banning families from reuniting with the Sikh settlers in the 1908 to 1920 period. There's actually legislation and laws that are saying, no, women and children can no longer come. Like there's something it's racist. It's a part of a racist machine that is stopping settlement in this country. And it's not just happening to Sikhs, it's happening to other communities as well. So it happened as soon as it became more visible. The visibility of Sikhs is what started the, anti-Asian riots movement and many other forms of state-sanctioned racism, the taking away of our vote. South Asia Sikhs in this country had the vote up until 1907. It was actually taken away, the right to vote. And it's something that we often take for granted. The right to vote is citizenship. The right to vote is a voice. The right to vote is power, land ownership. That was taken away for 40 years for Sikh Canadians in this country, and South Asians in this country. That's nothing small. That's huge. The only reason we got it was in 1947, India gained independence. And then it created a bit of synergy where, South Asians were seen as being legitimized somehow. So once again, I give long-winded answers to your questions because they're really complicated questions, in fact. And I'm very careful of not allowing the narrative of just, white people felt their labor was being challenged, like their access to economy was being challenged, as an excuse to be racist. No, it's part of this ideology of white European settlers thinking they have a claim naturally to everything and anything. And anybody who looks other is deemed as being the enemy.
It makes absolute sense, and that's also why I asked you these questions, because I knew you would give me these type of very long and juicy answers, because there's so much in that you can unpack and work with. But no, I completely understand what you mean, and you're correct in that the narrative of the other is still something that's continuously played by nation states. So like we're just with Brexit in the last few years, Europeans were made all of a sudden to be the other, like random, but that was what Middle England decided to turn on. Even with people, even with refugees in the English Channel, like some of them are drowning, and some of the comments that are made by certain parts of British society, and you just think, Jesus, racism isn't dead. Like it's not dead at all.
Such a lack of humanity given to anybody who is not, white Anglo-Saxon heritage. Like this predates like this century. This is like centuries worth of, creating concepts of race and hierarchy. And it's still, and that's why that knowledge of, Black history and authors who are Black activists have written about this for centuries. It's not just the woke movement we're living in. This has already been done, but now all of a sudden we're paying attention to it. So now we're more attuned to these conversations that have centuries worth of, a discourse built around it.
What I find interesting with the fact that immigration policies in Canada kind of seem to waver up and down is that very soon after 1908, so in 1911, the Gurdit Singh Temple of Abbotsford is completed and it opens up in 1912. I found a newspaper extract which said from the Abbotsford Post, which reported on March the 1st, 1912, that members of the congregation were very much impressed with the highly intelligent address delivered by priest Gurdit Singh, who spoke in his native tongue, obviously Punjabi, and in English. Could you explain how that Gurdwara came about, considering it kind of seems to pop up just after a decade of anti-Asian violence? There was Asiatic Exclusion League, who in 1987 led riots against immigrant communities. That was just one that I managed to find. So yeah, how did that come about, and kind of what was its backdrop in that respect?
Oh, great question. I love this question because oftentimes we hear the word sojourner. These Sikhs who came were just here to work and go back to India. Their sojourner status, they don't want to live in Canada permanently. And that narrative, and academics and historians have used this, and it really frustrates me because I look to the Gurdwara, the Gurdit Sikh temple, and say, this Gurdwara and what it represents is actually very counter to Sikhs only coming to Canada temporarily or wanting sojourner status, right? Temporary status. To me, this Gurdwara represents permanency and a claim to citizenship and identity in this country. And that took place in many different ways. But let's talk about the Gurdwara, for example. As far as I know, there's no Gurdwara in the world that looks like our Gurdwara. And you can find it by looking on our website, CanadianSikhHeritage.ca. Our Gurdwara looks like, from the outward form, the way the pioneering houses used to look a century ago. Like the outward structure has a false front, a gabled roof. It looks like a home. And even to this very day, when I give tours of the Gurdwara, I'll have non-Sikh, schools and teachers say, we just call it, the house on South Fraser Way or the temple house on South Fraser Way, because it's just seen as a home, right? But people know on the inside, it's very much a fully functioning Gurdwara. The Guru Granth Sahib Ji is there. The original Guru Granth Sahib Ji from 1912 is in another back room located within this space. So to me, I think this is a representation of the men saying two things. We're staking our claim as citizens to this land, but at the same time, we're just as, quote, Canadian as you. Right? We're going to build something in the outward form that is a Canadian building, looks like the way the houses looked at the time. And not only that, they purposefully chose the location for where the site of that Gurdwara is because it's of the highest elevation. I think there's something so incredibly powerful in that. These men in the 1908 said, give us the highest ground you can give us because we want people from far away to be able to know from the Nishan Sahib that there is a Gurdwara for them. And there is a space for them. And I've heard really fascinating oral histories that Ghadrites, so those fighting as a part of the anti-colonial Ghadr movement, would follow the light bulb on top of the Nishan Sahib at our Gurdwara from America. So the border is, located close by my city where I live. And they would walk from the Sumas, Washington American border to our Gurdwara site. That's such an amazing story. So this Gurdwara is anything but a temporary status representation. This is a permanent kind of marker of our space, here in Canada as Sikh Canadians or Canadians.
Correct me if I'm wrong to say that. Would you also class it as a safe space, considering all of the violence and the anti-immigrant rhetoric and all of just essentially the outside world? It was just a space where you could lock it all off.
Oh, it was. When you gave that stat about 90% being Sikhs, there were Hindus, there were Muslims, and when there was only the Gurdwaras at the time, I think by 1911, there may have been 3 Gurdwaras in British Columbia, the main one being the Vancouver West 2nd Avenue one. They would all congregate in these spaces and talk about, anti-colonial movement. They would read aloud Ghadr poetry at the podium. Like, could you imagine that? Reading Ghadr poetry within the Gurdwara Sangat space to say, this is our rallying cry, that we're no more going to be, quote, servants in India and servants here as well. The energy was a safe space. The fact that, food was provided, nourishment, a place to sleep for newly arrived settlers, Sikh settlers, was in these Gurdwara spaces. And that's why I say our Gurdwara has an energy because of those collective stories. When the Komagata Maru was stuck on shore because the racist Canadian government wouldn't allow the passengers to come in, shore committees in Vancouver, as well as our Gurdwara, met where communities rallied together and raised funds to pay for the lawyer, right? To be able to support the passengers on the Komagata Maru. These aren't small little snippets of our history. These are part of a collective of who we are as Sikh, right? We don't just serve Sikh, and we never have.
No, completely. And I think what I would take away from everything you said about the Gurdwara is it I don't know about it now, but from the history that you've provided, it definitely sounds like it was the heart or the brain of just Sikh activism, however you wish to define that, whether it's the Ghadrites or whatever kind of machination that takes, but it was involved in the struggle, so to speak.
Totally. And, when our vote was taken away, as well as we have meeting minutes, and they're the most fascinating meeting minutes of the Cause of the One Society Vancouver. It's actually a resource you can read online through the SFU collections, or it's on the Komagata Maru Journey website. I read these minutes as part of my research. The amount of time these community members spent rallying together, strategizing, speaking to local politicians, it is an activism and a collective kind of call to action like I've never seen. And this is when the community was very small. So yeah, I don't want to minimize the activism that existed. Absolutely.
And I think for me, why it's so interesting is because I would compare that to I've never heard of anything like that from any type of UK Gurdwara. Like, I might be blind to it or I might be ignorant to it, and I'll be happy to be enlightened by someone, but I've never heard that related to any UK Gurdwara. The historic connection with the first Gurdwara in the UK is because I think it was established with the help of Maharaj Dalip Singh or some kind of connection with that. But to compare it to a modern day, it kind of be like the committees of the local Gurdwaras or the big Gurdwaras in the major cities, basically being like, all right, everyone put your money and your skills or whatever it is together, we're taking down the Modi government, or we're going as in to actually put it into a real life analogy and bring it to what it is in terms of the stark reality it is. And actually, in all fairness, I find that gobsmacking, because in the UK, what you find is these politicians turn up when they need votes, put their Damal on, get a Sarupa committee member and make the politician of mateys or whatever.
That's what we've become. That's what exactly we've become. In fact, our Vancouver Gurdwara tragically hosted Modi.
Mad.
Right? The same Modi, right? They communities tried to protest, and this is probably getting on sensitive topic, but hey, let's call a spade a spade. They're silent now. Many of these powerful people who brought Modi and Stephen Harper, who's a kind of right-wing conservative leader in Canada, to the Vancouver Ross Street Gurdwara. And it's so tragic if you think about the history I just told you of that very Gurdwara. It's changed from the location of where it originally was. But if you think about what Cause of the One Society Vancouver was a century ago in terms of activism and who now we're placating to, I'm perhaps oversimplifying the politics of it. As you know, this politics is so complicated and messy, but it's tragic. It's sad that now, this is what Modi is doing to Punjabi Sikhs and farmers in India.
But just to be like devil's advocate, I guess I get what you mean by like politics is layered and it's complicated. But equally, I guess looking back, just like a historical analogy, which I like to throw out there, is that when the British Prime Minister came back after signing the armistice with Hitler, everyone was like, yeah, that's great politics. And then actually 2 months later, the Second World War starts and everyone's like, yo, you are a dumbass, man. So what I mean is like I respect the politics side of things, but equally I think your comment about calling a spade, like if you're a fascist, you're a fascist. And as far as I'm concerned, like Sikhi and fascism aren't compatible. So I don't.
Oh, I agree. And that's why, I love these conversations about our historical past, because I think I have a problem with people who will use parts of our history to serve their purposes. Right? Like our history is what it is. Our Gurdwaras were activist spaces. Our Gurdwaras were anti-colonial spaces, anti-systems of power spaces. And now you're 100% right, Amr. We're serving the people and, essentially kissing the people's ass who are harming us. So you're right. Like that's why I said sometimes we do have to create those boundaries of people who are explicitly problematic or explicitly fascist, right? And that's why, Gurdwaras are not, that we all talk about the committee issues, the lack of gender representation in these committees, the caste power dynamics in these committees. This is where all these conversations need to be had. We don't have gender representation. We don't have a caste equity in these spaces. In fact, they're separate caste Gurdwaras, right? Like that's a whole other tangent I'm going on, but it speaks to larger issues of what we're supposed to be and our history has showed us compared to what we've become in many ways.
No, you're right. Even where we live in Coventry, there's a Javidas Gurdwara, and when we were growing up, we never went. Like even to this day, I think I've been there once maybe. And we never ever went there, and I always wondered like why not. And it wasn't. I come from quite a mixed background, so it wasn't actually anything to do with caste because my mum's half white anyway, so there isn't really caste in that respect. And to be honest, like I was aware that we were Turkans, but I never quite understood what that meant. I just thought always associated with that being a woodworker. And Ramgarhia, from what I always understood, it wasn't necessarily a cat. So certain things we just weren't exposed to in that respect. But no, you're right. It is the committees, they've become very weird structures because what they were established to be isn't what they are at the moment. And I think a lot of that also has to answer for why the youth seem to disengage with these structures, because you're like, well, actually, and to be fair, actually, I remember the thing that kicked off this Ramblings of a Sikh thing was I was at a Sikh Society lecture during my first year of my undergraduate degree, and it was basically the Pradhan of the local Gurdwara had come with the slideshow of the 10 Sikh gurus and the Panch Pyare, and I was like, and he also just told that kind of sanitized history of Guru Nanak Dev Ji. He was born, he was a Hindu, and then he had a revelation, and then this happened, and you're just like, but A, that's kind of not really the truth. B, you've sanitized us to such an extent, we've essentially just become hairy Christians. And I was like, I need to do something about this. I was like, I can't claim to be a Sikh and then let my man over there tell everyone what we are, because it's not correct.
The other thing is, Amar, evolution is really important as a part of these conversations about our history, our growth, our questioning as a Sangat and community, right? So when we're talking about what the way, let's say, Sikh Canadian history was a century plus ago, our population was very different. The demographics and the knowledge that these demographics came with is very different. So we've exploded as a community. The divergences of lived experiences and, double migration histories and demographics has grown. So I understand that there's going to be evolution in our communities, right? And so I keep mentioning, how we intersect transphobia and homophobia in our conversations, because now that's something we have to be attuned to as well as a Sikh Sangat, and we're not yet, because there's so much violence being enacted on, historians and activists and academics who identify as LGBTQ2IA, right? So why I say that is I'm just always mindful of what kind of evolution are we in right now? And, what are we heading towards and what do we ideally want? And for me, it is really about looking to my past to shape my future. It sounds very cheesy, but it really helps me.
I know what you mean. It's a very similar thing with myself, which is like, how do you understand who you are and your identity and where you fit into the wider scheme of things? And also from a personal perspective, coming from a mixed race background, I was always like, well, my grandma is blonde and blue eyed and my dad is like quite dark skinned. So I've always been like, how, like what, like, and it never registered to me that there was a difference until someone else was like, yo, your grandma ain't the same color as you. And I was like, huh? Like, and I know it sounds really stupid, right? But it's only when someone others you do you realize, well, hold on, yeah, I am different.
Because we want to box ourselves. We want to box each other and say, like you started off by saying, what do you identify as? Really, I could say I identify as a mother. I identify as you know what I mean? Like I can identify myself 50 different ways. But we want to box ourselves in a simple way so we can figure each other out. And I think we have to get rid of that concept. We figure each other out by talking to each other. That's it. Yeah.
And I think just quickly kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier, that's probably the biggest problem. People are either not knowing how to engage constructively or just don't bother or like don't bother at all. Okay, just continuing then with Canadian Sikh history. The Good Sikh Temple of Abbotsford's established. And then something that for me was quite interesting was before the Komagata Maru incident, there was kind of a twin boat and the Panama Maru, if I'm correct. And essentially what happened was there were 38 Sikhs. Well, from what I read, it said Punjabi Sikhs. So I guess that's probably important. And there was a Canadian judge who essentially overruled them being deported. And it was kind of off the back of that a Singaporean businessman, Gurdit Singh Sandhu, decided to try to circumvent the immigration laws in Canada and hired privately the Komagata Maru ship. I just want to know a little bit more about the initial the court case and kind of just what that's about. And then is there really much of a correlation between the two boats in terms of like, was the success of one really the deciding factor to kind of set sail with the second one?
Oh, that's a really great question. I think all your facts are correct on this one. I'm going to tell a funny side story. So I took a course at UVic, which is a university here, and we reenacted the courtroom scene in the Panama Maru. And so I played the lawyer. So I just a random funny story because I love drama. And we played it out in the original court where that case took place. So it was really neat being a part of that experience. But I think Panama Maru, it was almost a fluke, though, in many ways, that I think these men, like the judge happened to side on the favor of these men, because as we've seen, the state design was designed to kind of exclude, right, Sikh Canadians and not allow Sikh Canadians in. It by all means and purposes ended up being just luck that these men were all allowed to come in and the judge happened to side on them. Gurdit Singh's angle has been studied by many different historians, and some say that, it was an economic enterprise, and naturally, right? He's a merchant. He wants to be able to see if he can circumvent the racist legislation that said you only can come to Canada on a continuous journey from your origin country. And Canada stopped CPR ships from doing a straight continuous passage. So it was designed to stop people from India coming to Canada, very specifically designed. So Gurdit Singh did have a kind of a ding moment and a business opportunity and said, hey, I'm going to charter my own ship and I'm going to circumvent this law. And if it works, I'm going to make a business out of it. But I also don't want to minimize the fact that, that may have been a reason for him to do it. He also knew from his memoirs that he was part of something much bigger. He was part of a conversation of empire as well, because these Sikhs and these South Asians and these citizens of India saw themselves as a part of the British Empire. So it was also a challenge to the British Empire to say, okay, you're going to call us one of your own. You're going to call us into war when you go into World War I and World War II. It'll be World War II later. Let's see whether you really think we're one of yours, right? Like even the passport said, citizens of the British Empire. Gurdit Singh went in knowing that. So I think it's really important to have that nuance when we question Gurdit Singh's reasonings. What was he doing? Was it all selfish? I think that's falling into a trap of homogenizing who he was. And I think he had a bigger purpose to challenge racist systems, to challenge empire, to challenge Canadian state formations, which were trying to stop Sikhs from coming to Canada. I literally forgot the question you were asking as I'm talking.
No, not a problem. You've answered the question in relation to is actually kind of the first ship related to the second ship, and you've knocked that on the head. And then we've spoken about Gurdit Singh Sandhu. Now, just continuing with him, the interesting thing that I read, and again, it may be incorrect, so please correct me if I'm wrong, is that at the same time as that he was hiring this boat, he was also publicly going out there and basically ridiculing the Ghadrite movement.
I didn't hear that. I've never heard that.
Okay, well then in that case, we'll perhaps shelve this question, but I will send you what I found, and it'll be interesting just to get your input on it, essentially. Yeah, no, fair enough. Yeah, basically I read something and it said that whilst he was in Hong Kong, he publicly espoused the Ghadrite cause and was like, yeah, I've got nothing to do with them.
Because you know what happened when they were in Hong Kong, Bhagwan Singh Gyani, I think that was his name, went on the ship Komagata Maru. And I have Bhagwan Singh's biography, which is an amazing read. He is a explicit Ghadrite, and he went on the ship and did his amazing speeches rallying the people on the Komagata Maru. And I believe that's a historical proven fact. He did that. And I know even in Gurdit Singh's own memoirs, he wrote his own memoirs in Punjabi and it's been translated in English. I don't recall reading that, but I'd be interested to know where you read that and what his thoughts were of the Ghadr movement.
Sure. Yeah, no, not a problem. Well, whilst we're on the topic of the Ghadr movement, I would love you to just explain for everyone listening, who are they, what are they, where did they start from, and how do they tie into the Komagata Maru incident? Because we've kind of touched upon it briefly, but yeah, I'd love to get your input on that.
So the Ghadr movement, Ghadr means mutiny or rebellion, is an anti-colonial movement trying to get rid of British rule in India. But what's fascinating about it is it was a written movement, just like we're seeing Tractor to Twitter. The correlations are fascinating if you ask me, but just like we're seeing happening now with the farmers' protest movement, it was a movement through the power of pen and the power of print and the power of conveying messages through that poetry and spoken word. It began in San Francisco. So, a lot of the North American subcontinent is connected through the Pacific Northwest Passage. And that runs from San Francisco, California, Oregon, to Vancouver. This is all connected by a specific, sea connection. And even though it did traverse America and Canada. So that movement began in San Francisco and essentially worked its way up along that Pacific Northwest coast. And it was spread through poetry being read in different Gurdwaras in America and Canada, spread through newspapers being shared. And, if you picture this a century ago, there was no phones, no social media, the way we have accessibility now. The way this rose was so incredibly impactful that it created this revolutionary movement where people in the diaspora, where South Asians in the diaspora were trying to get rid of colonial rule in India. The most powerful part of the movement was from the years 1913 to 1918. Unfortunately, the movement didn't have as much impact in India. And there's fascinating stories about Ghadrite allying in Germany, I believe, or parts of Russia, speaking to leaders in these different countries. So it was really almost like a pan-world movement, or at least they tried to make it into a pan-world movement. But for me, what's fascinating is the poetry of Ghadr. And I literally have a book on my desk right now as we speak called Ghadr Leher da Kavita. And it's just poems, a collection of poems in Punjabi. And they are some of the most powerful words that affect us to this very day. Like the things that they wrote about in 1913, 1912 and onwards is so impactful to us today. So it's almost like these histories are evergreen. These histories are tragically or not tragically constantly perpetuating, right? I think that's, even though we can look at, okay, didn't have the outcome it wanted, but for me, the impact of Ghadr, and many historians have studied it, is just the way they traversed communication lines through the power of poetry and revolution in the Gurdwaras.
No, I think that's a fair response to that question. Just staying with the Komagata Maru incident, obviously it exposed once again that Canada is a white man's country, obviously in that period, it was all to do with the empire and colonialism, etc. It also exposed the unfairness of British colonial rule and the second-class nature of South Asians, because I believe when the ship ended up going back to Calcutta, which happens to be the place my granddad's from, basically most of the people on the ship were just beaten by the police, and I think I read a few people died as a result. So what I wanted to ask, especially with your knowledge of Sikh settlement within Canada over the last 100 years or so, is how significant was the Komagata Maru incident to changing attitudes toward immigration at that point? And then how has its legacy affected immigration within Canada since?
I think my assessment of it would be that in the moment Komagata Maru happened and the ship was sent back and that violence erupted, I don't think there was immediate response or like a legacy or impact, because World War I had started. So it's actually quite a tragic picture if you think about it, right? Like the men on board the Komagata Maru ship are going back. In the same moment, many Sikh soldiers are heading into war for Britain. Like literally those kind of two moments, historical moments, are colliding. And once again, cognitive dissonance in terms of when empire calls, who is there, versus when, certain people want to migrate and settle, who's wanted and not wanted. So in that moment, there wasn't necessarily impact. I think it's the reflective moments when historiography enters, when historians like Hugh Johnston and Renisa Mawani and so many others started saying, wow, like this kind of lightning rod moment in 1914 hasn't really been studied a lot, but it's actually got incredible impact. That's the work that shows this was such a direct challenge to racist Canadian legislation as a part of larger systems of legislation and racism, that it can't be underestimated, right? And that's why the work of Hugh Johnston's is so important, because he's really the one who first shed light on how important this was. And this is what happens when historical moments aren't given their due limelight or due assessment. This is why historians are so important, right? Like that's our job, is to go back and reassess the archive, look at different multiple perspectives and say, literally something's been totally erased from our memory. And yet it was something that was so important. And so now in hindsight, we know how important the Komagata Maru is. It isn't just about what happened in 1914. It is about systems of erasure and power within the Canadian history, but also connecting to history of empire.
So does it not necessarily have an impact in the modern day? So it does. There's no kind of connection between modern day immigration.
Oh, it does.
Oh, it does. Okay.
So totally. 100%. Like there were incidences where in Canada, there were, I think it was a boat of Tamil refugees or refugees from Sri Lanka came in the I'm going to get this all wrong. This isn't a history I know very well, so I don't want people like slamming me for getting it wrong, but it didn't happen like too long ago, basically is what I'm trying to say. The way, and you mentioned this as well in the UK context, and, people who are literally dying trying to find a better place to live, we tend to dehumanize people's migration stories and desperation to find a different land space that isn't oppressive and violent. We don't understand the trauma that people are coming in. It was the same when Sikhs tried to come during the 80s, right? Sikhs from India tried to come and settle here based on refugee status or different reasonings. We just assume we know the reason why. We assume that they're here to under false pretense. Those assumptions come from what happened a century ago to other communities in Canada. Those assumptions come from racialized notions about people who are other than white settler European, right? So what I'm trying to say is the connections of who we allow to move freely between countries is dependent on their race. And it happened not too long ago where Tamil refugees were really vilified and not given the kind of nuanced perspective they deserved. So that's why the history of the Komagata Maru is so important, because those trends still continue.
Well, as you've explained, it's quite clear that they do. I'm aware that the next set of questions jumps kind of 30 years from the Komagata Maru incident to a photo that I found just while I was researching. I came across some archival photos of what the website had classed as early Sikh settlers in Canada. Well, it was the 1940s, so I guess you can count that as early Sikh settlers, although I guess that's like 35 years into it by this point. However, The title was Here's Evidence of the Prosperity of BC Sikh Settlers. The patriarch at the wheel owns a flourishing 300-acre farm at Mission and employs several men. Now, I know there's a hell of a lot loaded into that. One of the things that I just wanted to start with is in those kind of 20 years between Komagata Maru and this picture, which seems to show a very affluent farmer, what was it like for Sikhs in Canada?
Well, I think in the 1920s was when the Canadian government changed their restrictive legislations that finally would allow women and children to reunite with a lot of the majority men who were here before that, So we would see a higher immigration rate, I would say not in the 1920s, but 1930s, of like women and children now coming and joining their families. So now all of a sudden we're having capacity for home build, like literally, I mean home in the sense of you're building your communities now, because you can't unite, if you don't have your significant other. You can't unite, you can't create a community if there aren't children and women and, fostering that growth. So that would happen in the 1940s and 50s. And that's why you have like capacity for more affluent, successful businesses and farm owning and other business ventures boosting and emerging, and a significant class of Sikhs emerging in these periods as well. And especially when we got the right to vote in 1947, that once again boosted capacity and built a platform by which a lot of Sikh Canadians could do better and build their, capacity for growth. So that was really the kind of first significant boost. I haven't studied a lot of the kind of migration patterns beyond that, but I do know in the 1970s and 80s, there was once again a major Sikh settlement rise in Canada. And I think part of that is, of course, what was happening in terms of state-sanctioned violence in India at the time as well, just along with other push and pull factors, I would say. And now we have, the 1990s, like I think the second generation is what we would call them. Like you've got Canadian born kids now, right, who are living here. So when I talk about the changing demographics, that's also within that, right? You talked about younger generation. All of a sudden, these younger generation are now having conversations or not having conversations about 1984 and trying to learn about themselves or trying to pick and choose. Am I going to be Canadian? Am I going to be Indo-Canadian? What's East Indian in this mix? That's taking place. And here we are in, 2020s where youth are still struggling with identity. That's always going to be an issue, I think, for anybody, is to struggle with identity.
Yeah, no, like personally speaking, I remember having an identity crisis when I was like 15, maybe.
Wow, I had it when I was like in my 20s.
Well, this was the thing. So although we grew up in a family where we celebrated everything, Christmas, Diwali, Vaisakhi, you name it, like we celebrated it. And I guess what most Punjabis would call their nanny, we used to call her Ma, because in Bengali, that's what you call your mother. So we'd call her Ma, and she would actually do the whole Christmas thing, like the whole Christmas shebang, because obviously that was her tradition, so to speak. But we were brought up in a Sikh family, quote unquote, although mom came from a mixed background herself and never actually knew about Sikhi, she agreed to keep our kids and whatever. And I remember going to school and I was like, oh, and also I should add, she made my dad take Amrit with her. So what was interesting is at kind of the age of 15, I was like, I don't know. I don't really fit in with all of these guys. No one looks like me. We're not having the same conversations. We're coming from completely different perspectives and all of this other stuff. And I remember literally breaking down in the car with my dad and being like, yo, I don't fit in with no one. Like I was just effing and blinding. And then you may have heard of a group called the NKJ in the UK. They happen to be the same people that you could class as my sangat at that age. Yeah. And to be quite blunt, I realized I didn't fit in with them either. I was like this kind of Christianized Sikhi, and to be fair, I'm quite happy because it turned out afterwards that, you can listen to the audio recordings yourself. So yeah, so I kind of realized at a very young age, I didn't fit in, had a bit of an identity crisis. And kind of from that, I guess all of this has kind of come to fruition.
You know what's great though, Amar? Like, I feel like we have the organizations to find our space and place now. Like if you talk about what it was like for you when you were 15 and me when I was in my 20s, right? The amount of organization, and that's what I love. Even though some organizations may have different philosophies or different practices or different whatever, like you can find your space as a Sikh, no matter how you identify in multiple different ways, because we've grown so much as a Sangat, and there's so many different I'm seeing this now with the movement, with the farmers protest movement, the amount of organizations that exist. I mean, there's a space for us. And I think that's the positive. That's the beauty.
There is a tremendous amount of unity that's come out of this Kissan protest. Like the last person that we had a podcast with about Dasangdan. Again, we were celebrating the fact that the Nahangs were on the right side of history in this respect. Like, I'm not saying that they're not in 1984. I would kind of argue with a lot of people who would argue that the Nahangs were in the wrong, but that's just a personal preference. But I think the legacy of the 80s in relation to the Nahangs has kind of just been now all of a sudden blasted out of the water because they've turned up. They are on the right side of history, and it's brilliant to see that.
And we're allowed to make mistakes like going back to evolution. Why do we always look to something that was done and say, oh, but they did that then? Well, okay, but they're doing this now. It's the Deep Sidhu argument though, right? Like he's pictured with Sunny Deol or whatever. Oh, but now anyways, that's complicated. I'm totally opening a can of worms. But what I'm trying...
Sorry, I was just going to add to that, but that's kind of like saying, oh, Guru Gobind Singh Ji was friends with Bahadur Shah, and then Bahadur Shah went and put Banda Singh Bahadur in a cage. I see what you're saying. We have to be careful, obviously, who we're associating with and all the rest of it. But I think it's a big jump to go from, oh yeah, they had a photo, to he's an agent, or whatever the conclusion is in that respect. And I think also just one thing in respect to just what we're talking about now, I think it also just comes down to your perspective. So if you're looking at certain things from, I don't know, say the nation state perspective, you're just not going to come to those same conclusions. But that's again kind of on them, so to speak. One thing, just going back to that photograph of the farmer that I found in the 40s, one thing that seemed to be quite common in a lot of the archival imagery that I found was that it was, now I know I'm making a huge generalization in this entire, was it essentially a Jat migration? Was it the fact that it was farming that led to such a big Punjabi Sikh community going out there?
Oh, I'm glad you asked me that because I forgot to mention that, right? Like, we do have to acknowledge that the vast majority of this 90% of Sikh migrants who came to Canada came because they had caste privilege. Like, the vast majority were land owning, perhaps, dating back to being jamindars and getting perks as part of the British Empire. It goes back that far, that perpetuity of privilege. So that's why they were able to, afford to be able to take the ship to come here. Or oftentimes it was the younger son who would come because the older son would be taking care of the land back home. So the caste privilege was absolutely there. But at the same time, I don't want to erase the fact that Dalit histories exist in Canada dating back as early as 1904 and 1905. So we're currently working at the South Asian Studies Institute to try to, and partnering with organizations that work with, Dalit communities going back to my invisibilizing the stories, us actually not highlighting these stories is harmful as well. So it's so important that we look at the various different Dalit communities who have such entrenched history in this country. And why is it that we're not looking to them and highlighting them? So those histories do actually exist, and, multiple caste community histories exist, but the majority were Jat because they had that privilege of owning land.
Fair. So, they had to be affluent in the first place in order to afford. Okay, no, understood. That makes sense. So, as you've mentioned, South Asians get the right to vote back in 1947, I think. Is the fact that you've had World War I, World War II, you've had partition, are all of these essentially domino effects to forcing the government's hand in giving the right to vote back, rather than it being kind of this altruistic, like, yeah, I'm going to give all the South Asians their vote back?
Oh, your first point is bang on. That's absolutely what it was. But I also don't want to minimize the fact that for 40 years, our community rallied and sent delegations to Ottawa, spending their own funds trying to get the vote. So for 40 years, that movement was always there. We allied with labor union group. We allied with other communities like Chinese Canadians to get the right to vote. No vote, no war, or no war, no vote was a campaign, right? So that movement was always there, but it absolutely was a domino effect. I think the ramifications of what happened after World War II in the Canadian context, and kind of the partition and just that 40-year grunt work that happened, is what led to South Asians getting the right to the vote. It's a much more complicated and timelined history. And we did an exhibit actually looking at that entire history of the vote. It is very complex, but it certainly wasn't, like you said, this altruistic, all of a sudden, let's give them the right to the, it was no way in shape that simplistic. It was a 40-year struggle and a shared solidarity fight to get that right. And it is interesting though, I have to highlight the partnering with unions, right? Like, so a lot of Sikhs worked in lumber, in the industry of lumber. And so I think it was the IWA, it was called the International Woodworkers Association, was one of those unions that supported the South Asian right to the vote. And I think that history of unionization, once again, something we're seeing now, is a significant one. It's a cross intersection of, labor and race kind of coming together for that right.
Just making a joke off the back of that, I think someone's going to cut that bit out of the podcast and just brandish you as a leftist.
Oh, God. But, I would counter that by saying, okay, that's what I mean, though. Look at the history of what these sorts of union groups have done. That you wouldn't connect union movements to a right to vote.
No, but I think you've been correct throughout the podcast when you've been commenting about how a lot of history actually ends up erasing others. So one example that I use all the time is, and something that when I read it, I was kind of shocked, is that Guru Gobind Singh Ji's wife adopted a son after her son had become Shaheed, and also named him Ajit Singh in memory of her child. The only reason that I find that interesting is because within Punjabi Sikh communities, this entire notion of adoption is just no. Like I've never heard of it. The entire notion is almost like a taboo subject. I'm not trying to be an advocate for adoption with the Punjabi Sikh community, but it's just highlighting that actually bringing certain histories to the forefront completely changes your perspective on things.
I'm going to say something really controversial, and who knows if I'm going to get in trouble for this. Even when we look at histories of early Sikh settlers in Canada, I don't want to over nostalgize it either. Like, there are studies that have been done that these Sikh men, led double lives. Like, they had affairs with white women or other women and had children, and there have been fights and claims to territory and property. And even though, their family and children and wives are in India, and at the same time, there was also incidences of, homosexuality, these Sikh Canadians. These are and it's been written and studied by like Nayan Shah, an amazing book. I say this just to highlight the fact we erase these complex narratives because we want to just perpetuate a nostalgized version. I'm not saying these men didn't face incredible oppression and racism and barriers to access to anything, really. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is there's also multifaceted ways that they lived in Canada.
Well, I guess what you're actually saying is they're still human. So I guess with history, what we do is we end up, as you've said, we end up sanitizing them into our perspective. So if for argument's sake, I find homosexuality uncomfortable, I'm going to erase that from the narrative or whatever the issue might be. And I think actually it's interesting, the parallels from this conversation with the last conversation about Dasagranth, which is actually, it's about telling the real history. Whether that is difficult to process or not isn't actually the historian's concern in that respect. That's like your personal issue. And I think that's really important, actually. I've made note of the book and the author that you've mentioned, Nayan Shah, because I'm going to go and read it. It sounds very, very interesting.
He's really changed my perspective on how I look I would really recommend it.
No, thank you. There are two questions that I wanted to end with, really. One of the things that I've personally found quite interesting is that actually, let's just relate it to this. So the Canadian Encyclopedia website says, heightened Sikh consciousness has led to an increase in Amritdharis and Keshdharis, even among second and third generation Canadians. What I find interesting about that is the fact that the term Amritdhari and Keshdhari are there, just full stop. And then just adding a personal perspective to that, Canada, in terms of, so the book sales that we've had, in terms of outside of the UK, Canada is number one. Even in terms of the podcast that we've done, Canada as a country comes up number one every time by a large amount. And also to add on to that, like I'm sure loads of people are aware, but you've got Sikh, Punjabi, Canadian artists, singers, politicians. You've got obviously Jagmeet Singh. List goes on and on and on and on and on. Now, what I find interesting is, what is it about Canada that almost incubates this Sikh identity, spirit, whatever it is, however you wish to label it, but it is almost synchronous with being a Canadian. So there doesn't seem to be like an othering or a backlash to a lot of these people. Whereas even with just black actors or actresses in the UK, for argument's sake, there was a section on daytime television the other week where it was essentially like a countryside walk program where they just walk around the countryside and they show you like how beautiful it is and what the rest of it. And it was a black family, and the TV program people had like 300 complaints just about that, just the fact that they were black. So what is it then about Canada that seems to incubate this particularly unique Sikh consciousness, I guess, using the Canadian Encyclopedia's words?
That is such a good question. I almost feel like we should end on that because I'm going to be a while answering this. I'm taking notes as you were asking me. So I think that, yes, there is that kind of incubation. I love that word you used, and a knowledge around Sikh identity in Canada, but it exists in specific places. And there are still places across Canada that are incredibly racist, incredibly internalized, like almost like what we would call redneck versions of Americans totally exist in Canada too. The largest populations of Sikhs are like in West and East Canada, right? Like Brampton is a huge Punjabi Sikh population, Surrey, BC, everybody kind of knows of these city names. And so in these places, it's much more common to see Keshdhari or Amritdhari Sikhs. We know the language around Gurdwara. We're really pushing for that rather than saying temple, temple, temple. It's become a real push for us to say Gurdwara. Like we're going to learn your verbiage. You can learn our verbiage. So we're really claiming our kind of language as an access point to our identity. That's happening wonderfully, beautifully, but redneck spaces and really racist places exist totally in Canada as well. I think this is a tough question to answer, but I think once again, I'm going to look back to history. I think because we've been so politically astute, and I don't mean politically in the kind of pandering to capital, L liberal, capital C conservative. I don't talk about politics in that way. I just mean to be attuned to the pulse of what's happening in terms of policies around you. That's what I mean when I say politics. And I think Sikh Canadians have been attuned to that since the moment they arrived in Canada, right? We've been positioned to be attuned to that because of our role within the British Empire. We've been attuned to that because of our Sikh history too. The Sikh Raj is one of being politically astute and strategizing and using that as a way to to reap benefits in different ways. So I think our history is what has led us to have these amazing platforms we have. And yes, in actual political spaces, but also in the art, like you mentioned, the just reigns of the world and all that. So I think it's just because we stand on the shoulders of giants truly. Like, and I truly mean that. Like, we're standing on the shoulders of many people, not just Sikhs, right? Like Dr. D.P. Pandya, for example, was a lawyer who advocated so much for the rights of Sikh settlement to occur. He fought so hard. He fought with us for the right to the vote. Hussein Rahim was a Muslim activist in the community during the Panama Maru and pre that. He was one of the leaders on the Shore Committee. So these moments and communities and just constantly aware of the policies around us that shape our lives is what makes us as a community stronger. I also feel our Gurdwara spaces are so incredibly unique if we utilize it. Like, I feel like this is what I found in the Heritage Gurdwara. And we kind of started with the Heritage Gurdwara, and I think is really beautiful. We get to end perhaps with the Gurdwara spaces, right? Like our basic concepts of seva through langar, or even like Gurdwaras that have created Khalsa schools and Gurmat centers. We are raising new generations, children who know these histories. And we're teaching children to not just memorize histories and not engage. We're teaching these children to learn histories and question. So I'm hopeful that we are raising new generations of Sikh will perhaps choose to be Amritdhari and Keshdhari because they've learned their histories and they know what they are doing when they make that decision. I think that's why we have such an incredible presence in this country. And I'm really excited to see what we do going forward as well. Because I know in the question you gave me, you named Lily Singh and Jasrain and others. I do argue and I would push that those people who have amazing platforms need to use their platforms. And that's something that kind of bothers me. And that's what politics aside, that's what I adore about Jagmeet Singh. And I truly use the word adore. You said he's kind of an ideology, or the word you used was just bang on. But he addresses 84. He addresses injustices. He addresses, Indigenous injustices in such a real talk way that I admire. And he's around my age, maybe a little bit older as well, right? I really feel as Sikh, and our duty, our seva, is if we get a platform and a position of power and privilege, no matter what way that power and privilege is, it is our duty to speak out. And I just don't, I'm tired of people who have these platforms and stay silent. It really bothers me. I just feel like I may be sounding really judgmental, but it just seems the antithesis of what we are as a history. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think you're completely correct in terms of saying that even these people who have established their careers or kind of built off of the community, so to speak, to not be heard or seen when you could actually be playing a very pivotal role kind of speaks volumes. Just bringing us full circle, and perhaps this would be a great way to conclude the podcast, which is the Sikh Heritage Museum was established in 2011. So it'll be 10 years this year. What in particular led to the decision to create that? First of all, what led to that being built? And then secondly, was there any opposition? Because even trying to get anything built at any Gurdwara seems to embroil all sorts of crazy politics and machinations. So please enlighten me.
So the idea came from my mentor, actually, Dr. Satwinder Bains, who really was the visionary. It was a couple of years before the centennial was coming up of the actual building of the Gurdwara, which would have been 2011, would have been the 100-year celebration. So I think a few years before that, it was kind of conversation building where she said, the langar space is no longer viable. It's not being used. Why don't we create a legacy within that space where we convert the langar hall into a fully functioning museum? We would put track lights in and create the rails that we can hang things from the Gurdwara space. Really her vision and work to create the Gurdwara. And you, shockingly enough, there was full support from the Gurdwara committee at the time. There is a newer Gurdwara across the street from the Heritage Gurdwara that's fully functioning as a typical, what we would normally think of as a Gurdwara. That's where all their focus is usually on, is the daily functioning of that Gurdwara space. So the Heritage Gurdwara was actually kind of neglected, if I'm not going to lie. So it was a moment to revive that space and re-energize that space. What better way to do it than build so there was none opposition really from the Gurdwara committees. And Satwinder and I have been so privileged that as two Sikh women, we pretty much have khulli shutti to do whatever kind of exhibits we want to do in that space. And I'm very privileged and very blessed that we get to function in that way. It just works out nicely that we face no friction. We did an exhibit on Sikh feminism, and it was beautifully received. We did a beautiful opening where there was poetry read downstairs in the museum hall. Yeah, and just beautifully received. And it traveled to other places across British Columbia as well. So it's just been, I think it's just, once again, the spirit of Chardi Kala and just the good energy and goodwill is there in that Gurdwara. And that's why we're allowed to do what we do with the support of our Sangat and our community.
That's an awesome response to why and how that got built, and the fact that the entire community was behind it. I got to admit, that's a shock. And equally, the fact that you guys have been allowed just the space to pretty much do what you guys want. I think that's beautiful. I think that ability to actually all right, do what you kind of want with it and the things that you have done with it. I know we've got to the end of the podcast, and I really would love to pick your brain about Sikh feminism, but just to keep everyone listening on the edge of their seats, we'll leave that for a separate podcast. But no, I just would like to conclude with obviously saying thank you. As I expected, the conversation's been brilliant and enlightening. Thank you for listening to episode 8 of the Sort podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to support the work we're doing, please consider becoming a Patreon today. You can find out more information by following Ramblings of a Sikh on Instagram or Rambling Singh on Twitter.